that love today is a relatively rare phenomenon, that we have a great deal of sentimentality, we have a great deal of illusion about love, namely as something one falls in, but the question is that one cannot fall in love really, one has to be in love, and that means that loving becomes, and the ability to love, becomes one of the most important things in life.
You're listening to The Fromm Connection, a casual conversational podcast about the ideas of social philosopher Erich Fromm and how they apply today. The Fromm Connection is brought to you by the Erich Fromm Society of North America. For more information about the Erich Fromm Society of North America, please visit www.erichfrommna.com. And we are super excited to have you today for the very first episode of the Fromm Connection, where we make connections to Erich Fromm and his ideas, to what's going on today. And we're super excited to have you. I'm Lacey Delane, and I'm here with...
Hey guys, my name is Kike Autry, and I'm a practicing psychotherapist in the Houston, Texas area.
Yeah, so Kike and I are going to be your hosts, co-host, and we're really excited. We're pleased to have a wonderful guest today. Her name is Ilene Philipson, and I want to just invite her in to tell us all about herself and her writings and why she's an exciting person for us to have on for our first episode.
Hi, I'm Ilene, and I am excited. I am a sociologist and a psychoanalyst, and I am probably well suited to present on Erich Fromm because that was who Erich Fromm was. He was both a sociologist and a psychoanalyst. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm a supervising analyst at two institutes, one in San Francisco and one in Los Angeles. And I've generally written throughout my career, I would say, on the intersection between psychoanalysis and the social and the political. And since the North American Society has formed, I would say I really feel as though it's provided an intellectual and political home for me. So I'm very delighted to be able to speak on the Society's first podcast.
Yeah, we're so delighted to have you. And it's really wonderful to know that there are folks like you in the Society that's just formed in the last year or so and growing, who are willing and able to help get the word out about who Erich Fromm is and his ideas.
Yeah, it really is awesome to have you, Ilene. So I think I want to start by asking you this question. When we were all coordinating our schedules and brainstorming on what we would talk about in this first episode, wanting to bring, Fromm to a broader audience and kind of display his relevance for us today, you sent us an article that I'm not sure if it's already been published or it will be published, entitled "The Plague of Certitude." And I'm wondering, of everything you could have thrown out there for us to read, why did you choose that article to kind of begin this conversation?
So that article is for a psychoanalytic journal, Psychoanalytic Inquiry. And they're doing a special issue on Erich Fromm that's being edited by one of our Society's members, Maurizio Cortina. And it will be coming out next year in 2024, I imagine. And I will start within the world of psychoanalysis.
Please.
And shortly before Maurizio Cortina asked me to contribute to the volume, I had attended a psychoanalytic conference where speaker after speaker from plenaries were talking about the importance of importing the political into the world of psychoanalysis. But that importation was, in my view, a very narrow one. It was about talking about oppressed identities and the absolute importance of developing non-negotiable truths and preventing people who had different points of view. There were many psychoanalysts there who didn't see the relevance of importing the political, or they had different viewpoints on what the political was. And these people were booed and shut down. And in the realm of a psychoanalytic conference, I was astounded to find this. And increasingly, I think what we see within the world of psychoanalysis, but also in the political world in general, a tendency toward a belief in absolute truths, a reluctance to have dialogue, a belief that it is identities, it is through our identities that we are political, and that we increasingly see the world in a Manichaean fashion between, oppressors and oppressed, colonizers and colonized. And it is so contrary to the socialist humanism of Erich Fromm. And Fromm, throughout his entire life, rejected all forms of tribalism. And he was always interested in what connects us rather than what separates us. He is not only a theorist and a writer that I turn to over and over again over the years, but he also as a person and the way that he lived his life as a public intellectual. It's always given me sort of a sense of possibility and hope when I feel extremely discouraged, as I do now, to be very honest. And I often think when things seem really hopeless, I do conjure up Erich Fromm, because what historical experience conjures up the worst form of hopelessness and fear and anxiety? I would argue I'd vote for the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting to me is that Erich Fromm, who was a German and a German Jew, who emigrated from Germany in the late 30s, but still had his whole way of life in Germany and all of his relatives. What did he do in the midst of not only the Holocaust and what it meant for Jews, but the possibility of fascism taking over in the Western democracies? And people literally believed that this could happen. What did he do? He wrote his first book, Escape from Freedom, that, rather than succumbing to fear, he wrote a book that still remains my favorite. And he talks about the fundamental stance of human beings is the longing to belong, the longing to be connected to others. And we will do anything to avoid what he calls moral aloneness. Mm-hmm. That we would feel like a particle of dust if we weren't somehow integrated into communities, families, causes that are greater than ourselves. And I use that insight over and over again to think about how what he was writing about, which was why are all these people in my home country, Germany, turning to fascism? And I think I look around me these days and I see people on the left and the right turning to various forms of authoritarianism, various forms of certitude. And I think Fromm's central idea that we will escape from freedom, we will give up our individuality, our autonomy to belong. And I think we see this happening today. We see it in spades in social media, where people are wanting a sense of recognition, a sense of belonging, and they are turning to the community of Reddit, the solidarity of what used to be called Twitter, now X, TikTok, wanting to feel like, I belong and I get likes and I get retweeted because of things I'm saying. It forms a kind of sense of belonging in a world that feels increasingly out of control. So, and what are these groups espousing but certitude? They are certain, both on the left and right. And their certitude is such that it is defined by boundary setting, if you will, that I am going to, if you say something that disagrees with my worldview, I'm going to cancel you, or I am going to lead a cyber mob against you. And so it's kind of these regressive forms of communities of certitude, I think Fromm argues against in his incessant call for humanism, for what connects us, for solidarity.
That reminds me a little bit. I know Fromm wrote quite a bit on nationalism and have listened to some of his stuff on the psychology of nationalism. And I think those two ideas really overlap quite a bit. And I wonder if you could help us understand kind of how nationalism plays a part in our everyday life, maybe how Fromm, postulated nationalism taking place in our society today and how it's harming us in so many ways. I'll give an example. The way I think about it in a simple way is, let's think about college football. Everybody has their favorite team, right? But this is just a mini form of nationalism because it's all the same. Everything is the same. This university is the same as that university. Now, there are obviously differences, minor differences, but what ends up happening, I think, and this is a parallel idea to what you're discussing, is we become obsessively aware or thoughtful that our way is the only way. Our group is the highest group, the best group, the group that knows how it should be. And then we become so isolated and we start to be combative. And I think the society and the societal structure wins and plays on those things. But can you talk a little bit about kind of how nationalism and tribalism kind of are similar and are a thing in the way we do life today?
Well, I do think that I really appreciate your analogy to sports. And I have this intellectual critique like you do. But I'm a huge fan of the San Francisco Giants baseball team. And Emil, the sociologist Emil Durkheim talks about this, but nonetheless, I think when I am cheering for the Giants and I am in a crowd of 30,000 people and we are all screaming when we get a home run, there is something deep inside us that's affected. It isn't intellectual. It's something that we feel. And that's what organized sports draws on. And I think that is what we yearn for. It's a human It's just human. So those forms of need that I genuinely think we have for belonging, for community, can be manipulated. Now, I see it in myself. I sit next to somebody who hates the Dodgers and wants them to die, and is booing them, right? And I kind of get that, but there's this sort of need to have a group identity can become very quickly very pathologized. Now, what I would say about the question of nationalism is that in the United States, I believe the right has captured nationalism insofar, make America great again. However, I think the political left completely rejects nationalism. We've become, starting in the 60s and during the Vietnam War, very, very cynical and critical of the United States government and anything it stands for, and of patriotism. So I think in the absence of nationalism, there is a search for group identity. And so what you see, I think, is absolutely, make America great again on the right. And on the left, you see a sort of the movement to social justice, the movement to prioritize the most marginal. And together we can be outraged when the most marginal are harmed, or where, and our calls for diversity and inclusion become sort of a moral framework that I think replaces, in many ways, nationalism. And I think behind nationalism is what Fromm is talking about, that it can result in patriotism, and the kind of patriotism that allowed the United States to win World War II. And it can result in authoritarian Nazism. And, it's the longing to belong can go in all different directions. So Fromm wonders about how do we preserve our autonomy, because he's extremely interested in the autonomous self. He warns us against becoming automatons.
Yes.
And so how do we preserve our individuality, our autonomy, and recognizing this need that we have to belong? And he would say brotherly love. He wants us to recognize what we have in common. So it's a tricky business here, because I think it's kind of dialectical, that we want to be a part of, and we also want to be individuals. We don't want to be completely swayed by the group we're part of. We want to be able to be critical thinkers. Mm-hmm. And yet we have that longing to belong.
Yeah, that's really well said.
Yeah, and Kiki, I want to leave some space for you here, but I think I just wanted to throw in there, that sounds like the balance that we all need as humans, is we need our own autonomy, we need our individuality, but we need each other. We need to be a part of a group. I love how Fromm says, yeah, your group to be nationalistic with is humanity, that is our modern, our common humanity. It's humans. That's it. There's no group that you need to run to other than us.
Yeah. So, okay, Ilene, if I can ask this question, it may get a little bit in the weeds into like some type of psychoanalysis, which again, you've kind of foregrounded in your article, but I'm really hoping to ask it so that we can think through the broader implications. When you describe the groupthink and the orthodoxy that has emerged in American psychoanalysis, you then reflect on how that can create this dualistic or binary thinking. I mean, you talked about we live in a world of like Manichaean, good and evil, light and dark.
Right.
there was this fascinating point in your article where and I wasn't aware of this happening, so I would love for you to talk about it, where you describe survivors of the Holocaust who I think at the time were analysts that couldn't quite embrace their own traumas. They ended up kind of projecting it onto their analyses. And I'm wondering if you could just kind of describe that period in time and how that happened and what some of the implications are, maybe in a broader kind of context.
It's interesting to me that you picked up on that, because it's something I'm very fascinated by. During World War II, numerous psychoanalysts from Germany and Austria emigrated to the United States. And curiously, this was true, very much true, for the German Jewish analysts who emigrated to Israel. And this may be even a better example. They, all of them, wanted to deny their own trauma. And so I'll give the best example I know because I've written about this. Heinz Kohut, and I don't know if any of you have heard of him, he founded the field of self-psychology in the world of psychoanalysis. And Kohut was very, very, even though he was forced to flee Germany and he was taken to a transport camp in England for a year, and then came to the United States and denied that he denied that he was Jewish. And he never acknowledged his having any trauma whatsoever. And there's a famous case of Mr. A, where Mr. A is a German he analyzed, who, or a man of German heritage, and he was deeply affected by the Holocaust. And any time that Mr. A started moving in the direction of his trauma, Heinz Kohut would say, "That's your Oedipus complex," and completely trying to ignore, or did ignore, the Holocaust and his own trauma. And you have a whole generation of analysts who could not embrace their own trauma and instead remained these superior, all-knowing analysts. And some of them were the champions of ego psychology. And in their superiority and certitude and knowing everything, it was a cover. It was a way of denying and displacing their own Holocaust trauma. And I could go on about the sequelae of that, how it has affected psychoanalytic theory over the years. However, what I think you're picking up on from that article is when you see all of the oppression and all of the trauma in the other, does that allow you to remain untraumatized? So the reason I brought it up is today, it is people of color, it is trans people who are defined by racism and homophobia. We who are cisgendered and white are in control. They're traumatized, we're not. They're oppressed, we're not. Now, are there differences based on race and gender identification? Absolutely. However, it's a way, I wonder, of splitting the world in this way that keeps us in a funny kind of way, even though we're white supremacists or we're transphobic or whatever, we're kind of in control. We're untraumatized. Now, what's problematic about this division, that there is no question there are differences among us, you know, class differences, which nobody talks about in the left political world these days, but there are differences among us. But what about how we're all freaking out? How we're all, I mean, we're talking about the sixth extinction. We're talking about climate change. We're all unsettled by what the wars that are going on in the Middle East and Ukraine. We're all unsettled by the fact that Vladimir Putin has threatened to use nuclear arms. I mean, there's so much going on today that is frightening. And I just wonder if it's possible that a part of having this absolute division between the oppressed and the oppressors allows us or to displace or not acknowledge that we're freaking out, that we're scared. And I think Fromm would never have allowed for that, simply because he was a socialist and he saw the world very much defined by class differences, but he also repetitively, I know I'm being, saw us all in it together in some way.
I just think that's such a brilliant point. Thank you so much for elaborating on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting to hear just the history behind all of that as well. I think for those of you, obviously we have all new listeners because this is a new podcast. But if you're new to Fromm, having some of that background on his, his life and where he's from, and knowing he's Jewish and fleeing from the Holocaust, I think that's really great context, especially thinking about the books that he's read. And like you mentioned, Ilene, Escape from Freedom, such a founding work, obviously, for him. And so much wisdom can be pulled from that. Speaking of his books, I wanted to point out something that you had written in another piece that really resonated with me, being someone who's not an academic, a casual Fromm lover, is that you said something along the lines of, like, he's the most widely read psychoanalyst outside of Freud. And I think he's so unknown to such a broad audience, at least nowadays. It's shocking, but you think about all the books that he wrote and how many copies they sold. I mean, we're talking about over 30 million copies of books it's insane.
Easily.
Yeah.
Well, absolutely. So one of the best pieces, in my view, that has been written about Erich Fromm is Neil McLaughlin's. Neil wrote in, I hope I get this right, 2001, an article on Erich Fromm being optimally marginal. He's also written about Erich Fromm being a forgotten intellectual. Fromm, because he never fully, he was a psychoanalyst, but because he argued against drive theory and argued vociferously against Freud in many ways, he was never accepted in the psychoanalytic establishment of his time. Likewise, he was a sociologist, but he's really unknown in sociology departments. And also in the Frankfurt School, of critical theorists, Marcuse, Adorno, Horkheimer, he was also rejected by them because because of his stance on drive theory, fundamental. So he's a man who has deep understandings of each of these discourses, and he's on the margins. And that allows him, and I think this is what Neil was brilliant at pointing out, is that marginality is a very alone position. You are out there on your own in many ways, but it allows you critical insight because you're not enveloped by the academic world or the psychoanalytic world where, you only see it's everything to you, right? You're immersed in it. He was always an insider outsider. And that is one of the keys, I think, that persistently allowed him to have the insights that he did and such a wide variety of topics. What did Erich Fromm do? He isn't accepted in mainstream psychoanalytic journals. The Frankfurt School no longer wants to publish him. He's not affiliated in a permanent kind of way in the sociology department. He turns to the public. He wants to write for the public. And he, as I pointed out, is second to Freud, the most read psychoanalyst in world history. Now, you said, Lacey, that he, published over, he had more than 30 million books published and so forth. Well, you have to remember that The Art of Loving sold 25 million on its own. So we're talking much, much higher number than that. And I think that speaks to something really, really important. Again, why I think Fromm is to be acknowledged. Why did he sell so much? And I think that is his incredible accessibility, that he wrote in a language that the lay reader could comprehend. And I think he wrote not only in an insightful way, but a moving way.
Yeah.
I think he harnessed what a certain kind of passion. He moves us. He doesn't just inform us. I think he moves us. And that's another reason that I actually take him as a model. I want to be that. I want to be smart. I want to be insightful. I want to make good arguments. But boy, if I can end up moving readers, that's most excellent, because over and over again, it isn't just intellect, it isn't just cognition, it isn't just argument. It's our feelings are so ingredient. And when you're talking about nationalism, talking about belonging, it's our emotional life that has to be addressed. So, and he, during his lifetime, he was, in magazines, he was on television, he spoke before the Senate Relations Committee. He was a public intellectual, but he wasn't in a single discipline, and so he's sort of a forgotten intellectual and a forgotten psychoanalyst. And I think many of us have been trying to recuperate him. Because we think, as I think the two of you believe, he's extremely relevant today.
Yeah, and that's what we wanted to pull from you and your great knowledge and wisdom is, what is it about Fromm, that makes him worth talking about today, and I think we're covering that, pretty well. And I think, you're describing him kind of like the ultimate renegade. He was like, I'm not going to be accepted here. I'm not going to be accepted here. But you know what? This is an important message and it needs to get out. I'm going to write for the public.
I know. And, the psychoanalytic historian, Paul Rosen, he talked about Erich Fromm's courage. And I think that's what we need these days, because it's so many of us. I see that this in my psychoanalytic institutes when, you know, confronted with a lot of rage and certitude, that people assert this is a racialized enactment, and to accept any other understanding is racism. And what happens to people is they don't want to get attacked, and they may have a somewhat different view, but they don't want to be branded a racist or disliked, and so they fall silent. And you know, Fromm is an example of somebody who never fell silent. And as a consequence, boy, if you look at how he was castigated within psychoanalysis over and over again, and in the pages of Dissent magazine, in his debate with Herbert Marcuse, I mean, this guy got it, you know, from all quarters, and yet he really he believed in what he had to say. And I think, again, I think that is something that I think all of us should take heart in, and it's often hard because it's scary. I know that it is. I was recently told that a paper of mine for a psychoanalytic journal, which was originally accepted, was rejected because the editor thought that it would harm some people, because it was a critical inquiry into transgendered ideology. And there's a fair amount of sort of implicit or explicit censorship, and it's scary personally to put yourself forward and then have somebody you really respect, as I do, this editor, tell me that we can't publish it because it may harm some of our readers. And I think, quite frankly, what gives me more of the backbone, because I don't think I'm as courageous as Erich Fromm, having like-minded people that I've found in the Fromm group, you know, who see the world in a similar way, and all kind of are Fromm wannabes in certain ways, in various ways, in terms of his thinking. But I would also add, God, I wish I had the courage to stand up to certain stuff as much as he did.
Oh, that's great, Eileen. So I have this question for you. It's a bit of a conundrum for me, you know, as someone who would say he definitely identifies more with the left, you know, than the right. Is the whole issue around like identity politics? Because on the one hand, I do want to embrace the spirit, I think, that undergirds a lot of it, wanting to be cognizant and mindful of minorities and people that are actually oppressed, and all the divisions in our country. And yet I think identity politics is kind of the wrong move and gets distorted in so many unhelpful and unhealthy ways. I'm wondering whether it's your perspective or how you would channel Erich Fromm. How might you help us think about how to understand maybe the spirit of what the identity politics is trying to get at, while not maybe embracing the ways that it gets played out in our contemporary society?
Well, I think what has erupted in America in particular after George Floyd, you know, it really did reveal how deep the racism is in this country, and the fact that we all witnessed that, you know, we're not reading about it, we saw it
Right.
in the most graphic ways. And that was a breaking point, and absolutely should have been a breaking point. But here is my problem. I think I have a number of problems, but identity has eclipsed any other way of thinking about politics. And I've used this example because it happened to me, I don't know, last year sometime. My institute, my psychoanalytic institute in San Francisco is located in the Tenderloin. It's a beautiful building, but it's in a problematic area. For me to get to that institute, I have to walk from the subway station about 5 blocks. I walk, first of all, across Market Street, our main artery in San Francisco, that has people who are psychotic, screaming at the top of their lungs. I walk further and I am in the midst of homeless camps where the most incredible poverty exists. And also drug abuse, and their feces on the sidewalk as I walk toward the Institute.
Wow.
The Institute now never had in previous years, but now has a 300-pound security guard standing at the front. I walk in to my institute, and there is the most acrimonious debate going on about why we don't have more people of color in the institute. I bring this example up because that institute is a completely elite institution. In order to go through psychoanalytic training, you have to have tens of thousands of dollars. In order to see a psychoanalyst these days, you have to be wealthy. Mm-hmm. And so we are talking about an elite institute that people are crying in this meeting because they're so upset. And nobody is talking about my walk, you know, not Eileen's walk, but there is a complete disregard for the massive inequality that is caused by capitalism, by neoliberalism. And you wouldn't know it because what we're focused on is representation and disproportionality. So how many Black actors are represented in the Academy Awards? How many people of color are at psychoanalytic institutes or being hired at universities? And I think we have to have both and. We have, but if we don't grapple with the fundamental causes of this outrageous inequality that affects white people too, let us not forget that. I just think that we are ignoring what is making this society so unbelievably unequal. And yes, of course, people of color are disproportionately affected by this, but let's talk about what is causing that. It isn't being caused by mean white people at the San Francisco Psychoanalytic Institute. Maybe we're insensitive and we need to be more sensitive, but it's being caused by, you know, the captains of capitalism who want to exploit all of us. And that is, you know, let's face it, Erich Fromm was a democratic socialist. He attended to class. And I think that's the missing piece in the identity focus.
Almost like it's a distraction piece to keep us from being aware of, hello, this is actually more about finances and class than it is about, you know, color and race, all of those things.
We have to be able to hold both.
Yeah.
We have to be able to hold both.
In your article, you highlight the binocular vision.
Yeah.
You wrote so eloquently about that. Just being able to see things from multiple perspectives. I think we're missing that capacity these
Yeah.
days.
Because you think about, you asked initially about certitude. What is certitude? It's this.
Mm.
It's narrow vision. I know what I know. Well, hey, what don't I know? Or what aren't I focused on? And I think part of the reason we're not more focused on it, it feels so overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's easier for me to say, hey, Lacey, you're a racist, right? Lacey, or attack, the person next to me, the psychoanalyst at my institute. Hey, what you just said, I go by he, him, and you called me her. I mean, let's open our vision and think in big terms. And if you think of all of Fromm's books, what are they? They are big vision. He is just Mr. Big Vision. And looking at the interplay of all these things that are happening at once.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how big vision Fromm is. I love his appeal to spend our resources to figure out other ways of doing society and doing life to solve some of these problems. I wonder your thoughts on that and what he wrote and what he said about those things. I know, he had some ideas. One of them I'm a huge fan of, which is universal basic income. But I wonder your thoughts on kind of what direction he said we need to go in order to solve some of these problems. I know social media doesn't help. It's so polarizing. And our lives are just so dominated by social media today. But I wonder, what do you think Fromm would say about where can we go from here?
It's a really interesting question. I think he focused a lot, he in his helping found SANE, his Amnesty International, I think he thought in global terms. What would, Fromm be interested in today? What would he be thinking about today? I can imagine climate change would be something he'd be concerned about. I think he'd be very much concerned about the nationalistic, Ukraine and Russia, the, religious, regional Israel, Hamas, these international conflicts that he would probably want to intervene in. But I think also and this is what I think is important, is that so often our politics don't take into account, from an empathic point of view, our psychologies.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm always trying to look at is, it's easy for me to condemn what I see as a problem, like I just did, like the focus on identity, let's say. Well, I think what Fromm teaches us is why. He was interested in why the Nazis, or why people were interested in authoritarianism. If you think about one of the most interesting episodes of Fromm's life in many ways was Albert Speer, who was the architect for Adolf Hitler. Survived World War II and ended up in prison for 20 years. And he renounced he condemned himself for being a Nazi. But Fromm went to visit him in prison, and then they became kind of buddies, or at least correspondents, because he wanted to know what one of the key leaders of the Third Reich was attracted to. He wanted to understand from the inside out what would create an authoritarian like that, who was an intellectual and a cultivated person. And I think that spirit of essentially his curiosity and empathy of wanting to know rather than condemn. And Lacey, I know this is more general maybe than the kind of answer you were looking for, but it seems to me that that worldview of not condemning and trying to understand, why are people attracted to Trump? Why are people not addressing class issues from an empathic point of view, from a psychological point of view? And if you think about Escape from Freedom, he's talking about fascists who are killing his friends, his family. And yet he's always curious about why. What is motivating them? And so I don't know. I think that would be my broad takeaway.
So Eileen, I think that's such a good point. Can I ask you this question, kind of in light of that? I find that, and of course I'm biased because I do like psychodynamic psychotherapy. So I'm kind of big into like the unconscious. So while Fromm definitely moved away from Freud and others in terms of the drive theory, I think he still has a conception of the unconscious, or that there's a dimension within us that we don't always understand that motivates our behaviors. And so I kind of want you to maybe say something about that. But another thing that I'll add to that is, one of the things that discourages me about the public discourse on psychology is that it's a lot of either positive psychology or evolutionary psychology, which I benefit from, I enjoy, but I feel like they miss that more psychoanalytic, unconscious dimension to things. And this is one of the reasons Fromm has been so important to me.
He gave up on drive theory, but he didn't see us as vessels of drives. He saw us as agents, and but he always acknowledged the dark side. And maybe when you're talking about positive psychology, etc., we don't know ourselves. Ultimately, we know the stranger because the stranger is within us. Yes. That was the orientation he took. And I think that keeps us from, that sensibility helps us step away from narcissism or ever claiming, I know exactly what's motivating me. I don't. And so the unconscious is absolutely there. It is so ingredient in his work. And that's what he's trying to explicate. The fascists had a need, the need to belong, the need to identify with the aggressor, the need to identify with a strong person who they felt they could identify with. And we see that today. We see that so profoundly, in particular with authoritarian leaders throughout the world, but our own Donald Trump. Yeah.
Well, Eileen, it has been such a pleasure to have you today. Thank you so much. I think I have learned a ton today, and I've enjoyed myself. Kike, did you?
Absolutely. Yeah. No,
you better.
Yeah, with your article and this conversation, you've given me so much to kind of think about, and I'm excited about even applying some of these ideas with my clients. So thank you.
Yeah,
it's been a pleasure.
It's been great. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us. And we just appreciate your work and your time, like I said. So, and we want to thank all of you for being here and being with us for the Fromm Connection. And we want you to stay tuned because we have more episodes coming your way. And we want to invite you to connect with us, the Erich Fromm Society of North America. You can reach us by sending an email to Erich Fromm, N-A, that's Fromm with 2 M's, N-A as in North America, at proton, proton.me, or you can visit www.erichfrommna.com. On behalf of all 3 of us, I would like to say thank you so much for being with us, and we'll see you next